Okay, moving now to the individual polities and looking at some of the distinct features of each of those. We'll start with episcopal polity. This is the kind of polity that you have in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Anglican Church, of course, in the Episcopal Church. The Eastern Orthodox churches, I believe, are all Episcopal, or at least mostly Episcopal, and most Lutheran churches follow Episcopal polity, in addition to many others. But those are some of the major traditions that follow the Episcopal polity. Again, I'll point out the capitalization there, that this is the lowercase e that refers to polity, and not the capital E that refers to the Episcopal Church. I was rewatching the first part of this lecture, and I want to point out when I mentioned the Nicene Creed as an example of Catholic lowercase c, I meant, of course, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed of 381, which is what when we say the Nicene Creed in church now, it is actually the revision of the Nicene Creed from 381. So just to avoid any confusion, possible confusion on that. As I said earlier, Episcopal gets its name from the Greek word episkopos, bishop. And then that, if some of you may have taken Greek by now, and you might be able to break down the etymology of episkopos, episkope, to look over, to watch over. And so the bishops are the ones who watch over the flock. And that's why people like Calvin, who of course know their Greek and know their scripture very well, but hold to another form of government, can argue that episkopos is just the overseer of a church, which can be translated as pastor or minister or elder, and doesn't have to be this particular office that has developed as the hierarchy of bishops. If we look at sort of the most people are probably more familiar with civil government structures than church government structures, and so we'll have an analog for each of these polities in civil government that of course will be a little bit different. The main difference for all of them being that in church government we're seeking to discern God's will rather than following the will of a sovereign human or the people at large. But the analog for episcopal polity would be a monarchical government that is led by a king or queen, a royal line of successors and hierarchy of dukes and all that. That is the key element of this, is that it's ruled by bishop, of course, because of the name. That's significant, and it is a hierarchy of individual leaders. There is a belief in a personal apostolic succession in episcopal polity, that authority was given to the apostles and that was passed down at an individual level to successive leaders of the church. In the Reformation, the Reformers, and in the post-Reformation period as well, the Reformers certainly believed in apostolic succession, but they defined it in a different way, where apostolic succession had more for the Protestant world to do with the true doctrine being handed down from the apostles. And so if you are apostolic, you are teaching what the apostles taught. It doesn't necessarily mean that some sort of authority was personally handed down on this chain of passing down through the ages. That's especially true for the Roman Catholic Church, that idea of personal apostolic succession through a line of bishops. This is for those churches in the holding to episcopal polity. This is a primary way in which they affirm the unity of the church, the Catholicity of the church, the universal nature of the church, both in viewing the church as an entity that extends around the world, and also through the ages, that there is this unbroken line of succession. And again, there are passages like 1 Timothy, where it talks about the qualifications of a bishop that those holding to episcopal polity will point to as the scriptural basis for having this kind of a polity. Next, we'll look at congregational polity, and I'm going to pause it because I see that my face is blocking the word congregational, so I'm going to try to fix that. All right, there we go. Now you can see Congregational Church. This is historic First Congregational Church in Detroit behind me, and I wanted you to be able to see why I chose this as the background for congregational polity. The most important thing about congregational polity is local control, that every individual church that has this polity is autonomous in its decision making, in its governance. The Baptist churches are probably and congregational churches would be the main examples for churches that have congregational polity. And you might be thinking of things like the Southern Baptist Conference. There are conferences and conventions that have some kind of connectionality for many of the congregational churches, but they are voluntary associations. There is no authority in those larger bodies. They can tell a church that they can't come back to the meeting, but they can't make changes in the actual governance of that church. So that is a difference for the way that congregational churches will connect with other churches. They are voluntary associations for developing programs for mission and stuff like that, but not where there's any authority that the conference or convention will have to tell a local church what to do. They have their own autonomy for that. One analogy for a civil government form of civil government that might look like a congregational polity would be democracy, pure democracy, where it is the people voting on everything and the majority wins. Now, that's not an exact parallel in civil government, partly because there is more variation in congregational polity. So some churches that have congregational polity will have that kind of a democratic rule where they really will emphasize the priesthood of all believers, and so the decisions are made fully at the congregational level. But there are also churches with congregational polity that will be led by a single leader, a single elder, where that authority is delegated to that leader, but it's still a congregational polity. It's not an episcopal polity, even if that person has a tremendous amount of authority in the church, because it is not a hierarchy that extends beyond that congregation. It's still that principle of local control, even if it is a single person who has all the authority. There's a lot of non-denominational churches and a lot of Baptist churches that function that way, where the pastor of the church has a tremendous amount of authority and power, especially compared to Presbyterian churches, where, for better and for worse, the pastor has limited power. And we'll talk in lectures to come about why that is. And there's also a model where there is a board of elders that will make the decisions and have the ruling power for a congregational church. Same principle, where it is local control that makes it a congregational church, even if the congregation itself doesn't have the main power in that church, even if it's a group of leaders. All of those would be forms of congregational polity. Those would be the three main forms: a purely sort of democratic, where the congregation makes the decisions, a single elder-led or a multiple elder-led congregational church. And lastly, Presbyterian polity. I obviously won't belabor this too much, since we'll be spending we'll spend a total of about 6 weeks in this class looking at the details of Presbyterian polity. So I'm not going to try to cover all of that in this portion of a one lecture. But to get some of the main features of Presbyterian polity, especially in comparison to Episcopal and Congregational polity. I want to point out this picture that I chose for this. This is the Presbyterian Church in Westfield, New Jersey. Perhaps you are familiar with the old TV show Ed, about the bowling alley lawyer. It was on in the early 2000s. It was my favorite TV show when I was in college and seminary. And this is the church that Ed drives by in the opening sequence. If you haven't seen Ed, you can just Google Ed opening sequence and you'll see this church. When I first got to seminary, one of the first things I did was go to a worship service at this church precisely because it was the church in the opening sequence of Ed. So I chose it for this slide. Again, we get our name Presbyterian from the Greek word presbyteros, which is translated as elder. It can mean just an old person, but it also takes that role of to describe a position in the church, an office in the church, with the wisdom to lead often being associated with being a little bit older. The analogy in civil government would be a representative democracy. Again, we'll talk about why it's not exactly that, but it's for just getting your mind around how Presbyterian polity works, it's a pretty good model to look at, where it's not a pure democracy. The congregation does not, as a whole, vote on most things. There's a few things where the congregation votes, but most things are decided by representatives of the congregation as elders, and it's similar to the United States government, where we have representatives that make decisions on our behalf. So in that sense, it's sort of between Episcopal and Congregational polity in a lot of different ways, where it is connectional in the way that Episcopal polity is connectional, where all of the churches are united. They're not completely autonomous, but they're not hierarchical in the way that the Episcopal Church is. It's very intentionally not hierarchical, where as we move to higher graded councils, the people on those councils that make the decisions are representatives, again, of the lower council. So the session represents the congregation, and at the presbytery level, there are the pastors and an elder, or multiple, depending on the size of the church, that represent the churches at the presbytery level, and then representatives, commissioners from the presbytery level that go on up to General Assembly. So all of the decisions that are made at higher levels are made as representatives of the lower levels, and not as a more powerful body dictating what is to be done at the lower level. Councils are a very important piece of Presbyterian polity. We'll have a full lecture on the role of councils and what kind of councils we have, and different kind of councils, the difference between committees and commissions. We have jokes. It's so important to our polity that there are jokes about Presbyterians and their committees. The two probably most important in terms of the actual functioning of the church would be the session and the presbytery. The presbytery it gets the anything that is not specifically laid out in the Book of Order, authority-wise, is by default it goes to the presbytery level. So presbyteries have a lot of authority in Presbyterian polity, and then for the local church, the session has more decision-making authority than the pastor, or most of the time a larger, higher graded council to make decisions for that church. So sessions have a lot of decision-making authority. Presbyteries have a lot of decision-making authority. Sometimes in Presbyterian polity, we'll see different words that are used for those councils. If you're reading Calvin, when he refers to the consistory in Geneva, that is just another word for what we would call a session. If you are familiar with the Christian Reformed Church, that's where I did my doctoral work at Calvin Seminary, as part of the CRC. And in that world, they have Presbyterian polity, but instead of presbyteries, they call them the classis. So all of that language is synonymous for these graded councils that we have. There's still a good amount of local control, whether it's at the session level or the presbytery level, but there are more checks and balances than in the congregational polity, where it is purely local control. Just one final clarification about comparing Presbyterian polity in the church to the representative democracy that we see in the United States government. Again, there are some real similarities. The roles of checks and balances and power being easily abused when it's too localized in one place. The principle of a not absolute, but a good amount of local control. We see that with the coronavirus, where governors and local officials are getting to make the policy based on what's going on in their area. That is something that's similar, where presbyteries can make decisions on ordination and various things like that. And again, the main difference, which is the main difference in any analogy between church government and civil government, is that in the Presbyterian Church and Presbyterian polity, the goal of representative democracy is not to represent the will of the people as it should be in a pure representative democracy. It is rather the people giving their representatives the authority to discern God's will on their behalf. But that is always the goal of Presbyterian polity. It's not to find out what the people want. It is to discern God's will, and the representatives that are chosen for that task are the ones that are believed to, through the discernment of the congregation, to have the spiritual lives and the prayer lives and the spiritual wisdom to make those determinations for the church.